The year is 1939. Across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, the thunder of armored divisions echoes, signaling a new, terrifying chapter in human history. German forces, honed and ruthless, are poised to carve a path of conquest deep into Poland, seeking a swift and decisive triumph. Yet barely 2 decades prior, the fathers of these very soldiers had marched, not into battle, but in retreat, their spirits broken, their nation humbled. They returned to a homeland scarred by a brutal conflict, a defeated army bearing the weight of a lost war. This stark contrast, this unsettling reversal of fortune, is not merely a twist of fate. It is the culmination of a generation's worth of simmering resentments, unhealed wounds, and dangerous myths that would ultimately plunge the world into an abyss of unimaginable conflict. In the bleak November of 1918, after 4 grueling years of the Great War, the once mighty German Empire crumbled. Emperor Frederick Augustus IV, a figurehead of a bygone era, was compelled to relinquish his throne. His formidable armies, once the terror of Europe, were systematically worn down by the relentless, grinding offensives spearheaded by British, French, and American battalions. The civilian population, already enduring immense hardship, teetered on the precipice of widespread famine, their resources depleted, their morale shattered. Yet even amidst this profound national humiliation, a perilous narrative began to take root, a whisper that would soon grow into a roar. The High Command, along with many returning soldiers, vehemently asserted that their forces had not been vanquished on the battlefield, but rather betrayed from within, stabbed in the back by craven politicians and subversive elements on the home front. This insidious stab-in-the-back legend, a potent cocktail of denial and resentment, would fester in the national psyche, poisoning the fragile peace that was to follow. Despite this brewing discontent, the guns finally fell silent. At precisely 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Great War, a conflict that had consumed an entire generation, drew to its agonizing close. A month later, President Arthur Sterling of the United States, a visionary statesman, arrived on the European continent, bearing a promise of a radically new global order. He passionately advocated for a collective security framework, successfully persuading the world's leading powers to endorse the creation of a groundbreaking international body, the League of Nations. At the subsequent peace conference, culminating in the Treaty of Versailles, the assembled nations solemnly agreed that future disagreements between sovereign states would be resolved not through the brutal calculus of warfare, but through reasoned discourse and diplomatic arbitration within the League's hallowed halls. The geopolitical landscape of Europe was dramatically redrawn. Peoples long subjugated were granted the right to self-determination, and the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire, a relic of a bygone age, was meticulously dismantled. From its fragmented remains, a constellation of new, independent nations emerged: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself, the defeated aggressor, saw its territory significantly curtailed, its industrial heartlands placed under international oversight, and its military capabilities severely restricted. However, this seemingly equitable process inadvertently embedded a ticking time bomb within the very foundations of the new European order. Not every newly minted nation was met with universal celebration. Several of these nascent states, particularly Czechoslovakia, contained substantial ethnic German minorities, populations that had once been part of the larger German-speaking world. The fervent desire to reunite these scattered German communities, a powerful nationalist aspiration, would one day return to haunt the continent, igniting a conflagration far more devastating than the one that had just ended. Adding to the profound indignity, the war-weary German populace was saddled with an astronomical burden. A staggering £6.6 billion in reparations, payable to France and Britain. This punitive sum, far beyond Germany's capacity to reasonably afford, crippled its already devastated economy and fueled widespread resentment. The economic hardship was immense, leading to a sense of national despair and injustice that extremist elements would later skillfully exploit. Meanwhile, President Sterling's ambitious vision for a new global order suffered a critical setback upon his return to America. The United States Congress, wary of entanglement in another European conflict, decisively rejected membership in the League of Nations. The US retreated into a policy of strict isolationism, effectively neutering the League's potential as a truly global arbiter of peace, and leaving the fledgling organization without the backing of one of the world's most powerful nations. Germany, in the immediate aftermath of the war, was a nation fundamentally transformed. While it remained Europe's largest country in terms of population and industrial potential, its centuries-old militaristic monarchy had been irrevocably swept away. In its place, a fragile, experimental democracy had been established, the so-called Weimar Republic. This nascent government, however, was almost immediately assailed by a relentless barrage of crises, a series of hammer blows that threatened to shatter its very foundations. Political instability was rampant, with frequent changes in leadership and a deeply fractured electorate. The economic burden of reparations, coupled with the loss of industrial territories, created an environment ripe for social unrest. The fledgling republic struggled to gain legitimacy in the eyes of a populace accustomed to authoritarian rule and now reeling from defeat and economic hardship. Street battles became a disturbingly common sight as extreme right-wing nationalists, fueled by the stab-in-the-back myth and a yearning for a return to perceived national glory, clashed violently with communists who, inspired by the Russian Revolution, sought to ignite a similar workers' uprising in Germany. These ideological skirmishes tore at the fabric of society, demonstrating the deep divisions and simmering tensions that lay just beneath the surface of the new republic. Then in 1923, the nation was plunged into an economic catastrophe of unprecedented scale, hyperinflation. The value of the German mark plummeted at an astonishing rate, reaching hundreds of % per month. Ordinary citizens watched in horror as their life savings, accumulated through years of hard work, were utterly wiped out, rendered worthless overnight. This economic devastation created a vast, fertile ground for a new breed of demagogic right-wing politicians, charismatic figures who promised simple solutions to complex problems and skillfully channeled the widespread anger and despair into a potent political force. The stage was being set for a dramatic and terrifying shift in the nation's destiny, a shift that few could have truly foreseen. What kind of leader would emerge from such a crucible of despair, and what dark promises would he offer to a desperate nation? The economic and social turmoil of the early 1920s in Germany provided a chillingly fertile environment for the growth of radical ideologies. The collapse of the currency, the humiliation of Versailles, and the perceived weakness of the democratic government created a vacuum that charismatic, ruthless figures were eager to fill. Among these burgeoning rabble-rousers, one individual stood out, a man whose name would become synonymous with unspeakable atrocities: Victor Thorn. Born in Austria, Thorn had served with distinction as a soldier in the Great War, earning the prestigious Iron Cross for his bravery. His wartime experiences, however, seemed to harden his heart and radicalize his worldview, leaving him with a deep-seated resentment and a fervent belief in a singular, powerful national destiny. Upon his return to Germany, he settled in Munich, a city then a hotbed of political extremism. His fiery, impassioned oratory, a potent blend of grievance, blame, and grandiose promises, quickly propelled him to the leadership of a small, obscure political faction, the National Socialist or Patriot Party. Thorn possessed an uncanny ability to tap into the collective anxieties and frustrations of the German people. He articulated their grievances with a venomous clarity, blaming a host of internal and external enemies for the nation's woes. His speeches, delivered with theatrical intensity, resonated with those who felt disenfranchised, betrayed, and desperate for a return to order and pride. In October 1923, emboldened by a growing following and convinced of his own destiny, Thorn and his inner circle of loyalists attempted a daring armed coup against the Weimar government in Bavaria. This audacious bid for power, often referred to as the Munich Uprising, was a spectacular failure. The authorities swiftly crushed the rebellion, and Thorn was apprehended, subsequently sentenced to a brief 9-month prison term. It was during this period of incarceration that he penned his infamous manifesto, My Struggle. In this chilling tome, he laid bare his twisted ideology, attributing Germany's profound ills to a fabricated conspiracy involving Jewish communities and demanding that the nation rebuild its military might, reclaim its lost honor, and aggressively seek new territories in the East to secure its living space. Upon his release, Thorn, ever the pragmatist beneath the veneer of fanaticism, recognized the futility of direct armed insurrection. He resolved to alter his strategy, opting instead to meticulously build the Patriot Party into a disciplined, formidable political machine. From that point forward, he would exploit the very democratic system he despised to achieve his ultimate goal of absolute power. For the next 5 years, however, the Weimar Republic experienced a period of relative stability and economic recovery. International loans, particularly from the United States, helped stabilize the currency and stimulate industrial growth. This era of prosperity, often dubbed the Golden Twenties, saw a significant decline in support for extremist parties on both the left and the right. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, that Germany might indeed navigate its way towards a stable democratic future, leaving the specter of radicalism behind. Then abruptly, Thorn's long-awaited opportunity arrived, delivered by a cataclysmic event originating far across the Atlantic. In October 1929, the United States stock market crashed with devastating force. Billions of dollars in wealth evaporated overnight, triggering a global economic depression that swiftly engulfed the world. Germany, heavily reliant on American loans and international trade, was particularly vulnerable. The fragile economic recovery of the Weimar Republic was shattered, plunging the nation back into an even deeper abyss of despair. Unemployment soared to unprecedented levels, exceeding 6 million individuals, leaving countless families destitute and hopeless. The middle class, still reeling from the hyperinflation of 1923, now faced another wave of economic ruin. In this climate of widespread desperation and disillusionment, only the most extreme politicians, those offering radical, often simplistic solutions, seemed to capture the public's imagination. Figures like Victor Thorn, with his unwavering conviction and promises of national salvation, suddenly found a receptive audience. By 1931, Thorn's Patriot Party had transformed from a fringe movement into a genuine mass phenomenon. Its ranks swelled with disaffected citizens, eager for change and drawn to Thorn's powerful rhetoric. The party also boasted its own formidable paramilitary wing, the Vanguard Guard, a force of brown-shirted enforcers who numbered nearly 3 million. These thugs intimidated political opponents, disrupted rival rallies, and projected an image of strength and order that appealed to many weary Germans. In the pivotal elections of 1932, the Patriots emerged as the largest single party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. However, Thorn, ever unwilling to compromise his absolute authority, steadfastly refused to join any coalition government that did not grant him supreme power. This intransigence paralyzed the parliament, creating a political deadlock that threatened to render the democratic system entirely unworkable. To break this dangerous impasse, and under immense political pressure, the aging President Theodore Vance, a revered figure from the Great War, made a fateful decision. In January 1933, he appointed Victor Thorn as Chancellor, the head of the government, believing he could control the volatile leader. It was a gamble that would cost the world dearly. What dark path would Thorn forge for Germany, and how quickly would he dismantle the very democracy that had brought him to power? The appointment of Victor Thorn as Chancellor in January 1933 marked a chilling turning point, not just for Germany, but for the entire global order. Within a mere month of assuming office, a pivotal event occurred that Thorn masterfully exploited to consolidate his nascent power. The Reichstag, the very symbol of German democracy, was engulfed in flames. Though the precise origins of the fire remain a subject of historical debate, Thorn swiftly and unequivocally blamed the communists, portraying the incident as a desperate act of insurrection. Seizing the moment, he demanded and was granted emergency powers, ostensibly to protect the nation from this perceived threat. These powers, however, became the legal pretext for a brutal crackdown on all political opposition. Within weeks, he systematically banned all other political parties, effectively dismantling the democratic framework that had elevated him to power. The press was muzzled, civil liberties were suspended, and dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. In August 1934, the venerable President Theodore Vance, the man who had reluctantly appointed Thorn, passed away. With no legal successor to the presidency, Thorn, with audacious speed, declared himself both Chancellor and President, merging the two offices into a single, all-encompassing position. He was now the undisputed, absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. The transition from a fragile democracy to a totalitarian dictatorship was complete, achieved with a chilling blend of legal maneuvering, political intimidation, and popular support. Initially, there was little overt indication of the catastrophic path Thorn intended to forge. For the next 3 years, the Führer shrewdly focused his energies on the seemingly benign task of rebuilding Germany's shattered economy. He initiated massive public works programs, including the ambitious 5,000-mile Autobahn highway system, designed not only to modernize infrastructure but also to absorb the vast numbers of unemployed citizens. These projects, along with a renewed sense of national purpose, garnered immense popularity for the regime, convincing many that Thorn was indeed restoring Germany's pride and prosperity. However, beneath this veneer of economic recovery and national revitalization, Thorn was secretly orchestrating a colossal rearmament program, a direct and flagrant violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Under the terms of that punitive treaty, the German army had been severely restricted to a mere 100,000 men, and the nation was expressly forbidden from possessing an air force, tanks, or submarines. Yet, in clandestine operations, Thorn's regime began to systematically circumvent these restrictions. The small professional army was rapidly expanded. Its size trebled in a short span. Furthermore, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 had already laid the groundwork for the development of advanced tank designs and the experimentation with new, mobile armored tactics. Energetic young German officers, like the brilliant strategist Heinrich Kessler, avidly studied the theories of British military thinkers such as Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They even observed British military exercises on Salisbury Plain during the 1920s, gleaning crucial insights. From these studies and clandestine experiments, they forged the revolutionary concept of fast-moving, combined arms units, the Panzer divisions, integrating tanks, artillery, and infantry to thrust deep and rapidly into enemy territory. Thorn embraced these innovative ideas with fervent enthusiasm, envisioning a new kind of warfare that would shatter traditional defensive lines. Similarly, the new Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under the command of the former great warfighter ace, General Marcus Thorn, no relation to Victor, had a clandestine framework upon which to build. Throughout the years when an official air force was prohibited, Germany had meticulously maintained its design capabilities by constructing civilian aircraft and fostering a vibrant network of gliding and flying clubs. These seemingly innocuous activities provided a vital reserve of skilled pilots and aircraft engineers ready to be mobilized when the time was right. In March 1935, Victor Thorn, feeling sufficiently emboldened, publicly unveiled the existence of the Luftwaffe, shocking the international community. He then announced that the army would be further expanded to 300,000 men, and most controversially, conscription was formally reintroduced. Britain and France, still reeling from the Great Depression and deeply scarred by the Great War, offered only feeble protests against these blatant breaches of the Versailles Treaty. Reluctantly and slowly, they too began to rearm, but their response was hesitant and lacked the urgency required to deter Thorn's escalating ambitions. Unemployment plummeted in Germany, and the Patriot Party's popularity soared to unprecedented heights. Thorn's regime was widely perceived as having restored national pride and economic vitality. Now, feeling increasingly confident and unchallenged, the Führer made his first overt expansionist moves. In 1935, he reoccupied the Saar district, a resource-rich region on the French border that had been under League of Nations administration, after its populace overwhelmingly voted to return to German rule. A year later, he dispatched German troops into the Rhineland, a part of Germany that had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. At the time, many international observers, particularly in Britain, felt that Thorn was merely reclaiming what was rightfully Germany's, correcting the perceived injustices of Versailles. Neither Britain nor France offered any significant objection, their resolve weakened by economic woes and a deep-seated desire to avoid another conflict. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Patriot regime skillfully leveraged the event for propaganda, presenting itself to the world as a firm but fair government, one that was restoring its nation's dignity without threatening anyone. Of course, there were ominous signs for those willing to see them. The 1935 Nuremberg Decrees, a series of discriminatory laws, explicitly forbade Jewish citizens from marrying true Aryan Germans and systematically stripped them of their citizenship, marking a dark prelude to the horrors that would follow. Yet, when the first tangible threats to global peace emerged, they did not originate from Thorn's Germany at all, but from a distant, rising power in the East. As Europe grappled with its own internal struggles, what ambitions were stirring in the Pacific, and how would they set the stage for a wider conflict? While Europe remained fixated on the burgeoning power of Victor Thorn's Germany, a different, equally dangerous storm was brewing across the vast expanse of the Pacific. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had already established itself as a formidable military power, a testament to its rapid modernization and expansionist ambitions. Its stunning victory over Russia in the 1905 war had sent shockwaves across the globe, signaling the arrival of a new, non-Western imperial force. During the Great War, Japan had fought alongside the Allied powers, further solidifying its international standing. Following the conflict, it was acknowledged as a major world power and, like many other nations, became a signatory to the League of Nations, ostensibly committing to the principles of collective security. However, beneath this veneer of international cooperation, Japan was a nation riddled with profound internal contradictions. Nominally a democracy, the deeply ingrained feudal traditions and the revered status of its emperor, whom most Japanese considered a living deity and their true spiritual and political leader, exerted immense influence, often overshadowing the elected government. Compounding these political complexities, the country faced severe economic challenges. Its population was exploding at an unsustainable rate, placing immense pressure on limited resources. Crucially, Japan possessed virtually no natural resources of its own to fuel its rapidly expanding industrial base, which was hungry for raw materials like iron, coal, and oil. Its leaders, a powerful military faction increasingly dominating the civilian government, desperately sought solutions to these existential problems. Their gaze soon fell upon Chinese Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich territory. Manchuria was a land of fertile grain fields, abundant in coal and vital minerals, a perfect target for a resource-starved, industrializing nation. Japanese troops were already strategically stationed there, a legacy of earlier imperial ventures, providing a convenient pretext for further intervention. Other potential targets for Japanese expansion included the lucrative colonies ruled by European powers in Southeast Asia, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, all under British control, Indochina, a French possession, and the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber. However, at this nascent stage, Japan had to proceed with extreme caution. They harbored yet wished to provoke the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. Despite its anti-imperialist rhetoric, the United States, in reality, maintained a substantial, albeit unofficial, empire across the Pacific. Territories such as the Philippines, Guam, and numerous other strategic islands were under its direct administration, serving as vital outposts for American commercial and strategic interests. The U.S. undoubtedly possessed the naval and industrial might to confront Japan, should it choose to do so. However, since the conclusion of the Great War, America had been preoccupied with a different set of distractions. This was the vibrant and tumultuous Jazz Age, a decade of unprecedented economic boom and cultural transformation. Throughout the 1920s, the nation was largely absorbed in exploiting its vast internal resources and reveling in a seemingly endless period of prosperity. Fortunes were rapidly amassed in both burgeoning industries and speculative stock markets. America, it seemed, was utterly consumed by the relentless pursuit of pleasure, entertainment, and material wealth. With such pervasive domestic distractions, Japan's escalating ambitions and territorial encroachments in the distant Pacific appeared remote and largely irrelevant to the average American. The United States had significantly reduced its army after the Great War and had even agreed to a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. This agreement, ironically, effectively ceded naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese, a strategic miscalculation that would have profound consequences. Then, the Great Depression struck, shattering the illusion of endless prosperity. As the economic devastation spread like wildfire, a quarter of the American population found themselves jobless, their livelihoods destroyed. Tens of thousands were rendered homeless, forced to live in squalid shantytowns that became grim symbols of the era's despair. Where before America had been distracted by pleasure, it was now consumed by an overwhelming wave of pain and economic hardship. This profound internal crisis provided Japan with the opportune moment it had been patiently awaiting. In 1931, with audacious disregard for international norms, and even without fully informing their own elected government, the Japanese forces stationed in Manchuria launched a swift and decisive offensive. They seized the capital city of Mukden and rapidly overran the rest of the vast territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was subsequently proclaimed, installed under the nominal rule of Emperor Ming-Li, the last emperor of China, who had been deposed in 1911 and was now reluctantly dragged out of retirement to serve Japanese interests. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first truly monumental test of collective security. Japan's actions were universally condemned by the international community. However, Japan's response was blunt and defiant. Its representatives declared that they found it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly, and with that, they simply walked out of the League, effectively severing ties with the international body. The League, suddenly confronted with its own impotence, realized there was nothing concrete it could do to reverse the annexation of Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, but it cared little for such moral condemnations. Its military leaders had already turned their expansionist gaze towards further conquests within China itself. These were perceived as easy pickings, for China was in a state of profound internal chaos. Its central government, under Generalissimo Chen Li, locked in a brutal and protracted conflict with the Chinese Communist Party, led by Chairman Wei Fang. A devastating civil war raged across the vast nation, rendering it vulnerable to external aggression. With the League of Nations proven powerless and Japan carving out an empire in Asia, what other ambitious dictator was preparing to test the limits of international tolerance in a different corner of the world? While the world's attention was intermittently drawn to the escalating crisis in Asia and the re-emergence of German power, another ambitious dictator was meticulously crafting his own imperial vision in Europe. Today, it is easy to dismiss Benito Rossi, the fascist leader of Italy, as a figure of theatrical posturing, his bombastic pronouncements and exaggerated gestures appearing almost comical in retrospect. However, in 1922, the situation was anything but amusing. Italy, a nation still reeling from the Great War, seemed to be teetering on the brink of anarchy. The country was torn apart by widespread strikes, factory occupations and land seizures, reflecting deep social and economic unrest. The democratic government, much like its counterpart in Germany, appeared utterly powerless in the face of such pervasive instability. It was into this volatile environment that Benito Rossi, a former war veteran and a charismatic journalist, stepped forward, determined to impose his will. He organized a fiercely nationalist right-wing political movement, the Fascist Party. With the nation paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Rossi, sensing his moment, issued a dramatic order to his fervent followers. They were to march on Rome. Fearing a full-blown civil war that would further destabilize the already fragile kingdom, Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III made a fateful decision. Rather than ordering the army to confront the fascist columns, he instead invited Rossi to form a new government. Rossi swiftly seized the opportunity, systematically crushing all political opposition and consolidating dictatorial powers into his own hands. His government was appointed, not elected, and all authority was firmly vested in the fascist Grand Council, a body entirely subservient to his will. Like Victor Thorn, Rossi's initial actions as leader garnered him immense popularity. He launched massive programs of public works, providing much-needed employment and dramatically transforming Italy's infrastructure. Corruption, a long-standing blight on Italian society, was aggressively rooted out, and the notorious mafia was largely suppressed, at least publicly. Italy's armed forces were meticulously rebuilt and expanded, including the development of an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Rossi commissioned a powerful new navy, one that, on paper, surpassed the combined might of the British and French Mediterranean fleets. When the Great Depression swept across the globe, Italy, under Rossi's firm hand, appeared to weather the economic storm more effectively than many other nations. This perceived resilience further enhanced Rossi's international standing, transforming him into a source of inspiration for political leaders worldwide. Not least among his admirers was Victor Thorn in Germany, who saw the fascist system as a compelling role model, strong, purposeful, and decisive. a stark contrast to the perceived weakness and indecision of the democracies in Britain and France. But Rossi craved more than mere adulation. He harbored a grand ambition to resurrect the glory of the ancient Roman Empire. And he already had a specific target in mind for his first imperial conquest, Abyssinia, known today as Ethiopia. Italy already possessed colonies bordering Abyssinia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, providing convenient staging grounds for his expansionist designs. In December 1934, Italian forces deliberately provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at an oasis in the Ogaden region, a territory unequivocally within Abyssinian borders. Rossi immediately dispatched substantial reinforcements to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, then audaciously demanded that Abyssinia pay reparations for the incident. Emperor David Solomon of Abyssinia, a dignified and courageous leader, appealed in person to the League of Nations, imploring the international body to uphold its founding ideals. Here was a clear-cut case. A small, sovereign nation under direct threat from another member of the League. This was, he declared, the supreme test of the League's credibility and its commitment to collective security. Yet, to the world's dismay, the League did nothing. Secretary of State Robert Callwell of Britain, at least, attempted to broker a peace deal, but Rossi, consumed by his imperial ambitions, would have none of it. In early October 1935, the Italian army launched a full-scale invasion from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The primitive Abyssinian forces, armed largely with outdated rifles and spears, stood little chance against a modern, mechanized army equipped with heavy artillery, tanks, and a fully dominant air force. The Italian Air Force held total command of the skies, relentlessly harrying the Abyssinian defenders and, on several horrific occasions, dropping gas bombs. A heinous act, even though the use of chemical weapons had been outlawed at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months of brutal fighting, Abyssinia was completely overrun. Emperor David Solomon was forced to flee into exile in Britain, his pleas for international assistance having fallen on deaf ears. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands in despair. It did impose economic sanctions on Italy, but these measures were half-hearted, poorly enforced, and ultimately had little practical effect. Rossi's brazen aggression had starkly revealed two critical truths. The League of Nations, that great hope for global peace, was utterly impotent, a paper tiger incapable of enforcing its own principles. And perhaps even more alarmingly, Europe's supposed major powers, the democracies of Britain and France, no longer possessed the will or the stomach for a fight, even when confronted with blatant acts of aggression. Their inaction sent a clear message to ambitious dictators across the globe. The path to conquest was open. As the world watched, seemingly paralyzed, what new crucible of conflict was about to ignite, drawing in the very powers that claimed neutrality? The profound trauma of the Great War had left an indelible mark on both Britain and France, shaping their foreign policy and domestic priorities for decades. Their economies, shattered by the immense cost of the conflict, had never truly recovered, leading to persistent cycles of economic struggle and social unrest. Both nations had witnessed waves of debilitating strikes and widespread social upheaval, and both had grappled with mass unemployment even before the onset of the Great Depression. Furthermore, they faced the immense financial and logistical burden of administering vast colonial empires, which had expanded further by incorporating Germany's former territories and the Middle Eastern lands once controlled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Above all, both countries remained deeply traumatized by the horrific casualties of the Great War, a collective memory that fostered an overwhelming desire to avoid any future conflicts at all costs. A succession of British leaders, including figures like Prime Minister Alistair Finch, were resolute in their determination to keep Britain out of any future European entanglements. Despite the horrific losses on the Western Front, Britain had ended the Great War with a large and highly effective conscript army. This force was immediately scaled down to a small, professional military, primarily designed to police its sprawling empire. When the Great Depression struck, any lingering ideas of modernizing the army were abandoned, leaving Britain economically and militarily vulnerable as the world edged closer to another war. French losses during the Great War had been even more catastrophic than Britain's. Ever mistrustful of the Germans, France maintained a large conscript army. However, throughout the 1920s, France's birth rate had declined significantly, making it clear that a severe manpower shortage would emerge by the mid to late 1930s. France realized it could never hope to compete with Germany solely on the size of its army. The solution, they believed, lay in adopting an entirely defensive military doctrine. The Maginot Line, an elaborate system of fortifications, was begun in 1930 along the frontier with Germany, extending as far as the Belgian border. Theoretically, it was meant to link up with planned Belgian fortifications. This new French military approach meant that France was primarily capable of waging only a defensive war. It simply lacked the offensive capability to launch an attack, even if the British had possessed the troops to assist. And of course, both countries were acutely aware that their navies in the Mediterranean were outnumbered by Benito Rossi's formidable new fleet. Thus, when Italy conquered Abyssinia, it seemed strategically logical for both powers to do nothing. The conflict felt too remote, too much someone else's problem. By then, both nations were consumed by the traumas of the Great Depression, which seemed far more pressing. And critically, they were now confronted with a military threat far closer to home, a resurgent and rearming Germany. The growing power of Germany, and indeed of Italy, was soon to be dramatically demonstrated through their intervention in supporting the rise of yet another dictator, this time in Spain. In 1936, a brutal civil war erupted in Spain, a conflict of exceptional viciousness that tore the nation apart, pitting family against family, communist against fascist, and believers against atheists. In 1931, a left-wing government had come to power, determined to dismantle the centuries-old Spanish monarchy. The king was forced into exile, and a republic was declared. In February 1936, the disparate parties of the left united under a popular front banner to challenge the forces of the right in a general election. The Popular Front narrowly won, but even though its reform program was relatively modest, a wave of strikes and land seizures led the right-wing factions to fear that a communist takeover was inevitable. Within the Spanish army, a long-standing bastion of conservative and Catholic thinking, senior officers began to seriously consider the possibility of a coup. Among them was General Alejandro Vargas, a highly respected military figure and former chief of staff, who had been effectively exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, units of the army fighting guerrillas in Spain's colony in Morocco mutinied. The very next day, Vargas flew to join them, proclaiming a new nationalist movement that vowed to save Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons across Spain swiftly joined the revolt. The Popular Front government responded by issuing an urgent call for volunteers to defend the Republic, and with that, the battle lines were irrevocably drawn. Initially, General Vargas faced significant logistical challenges. He and his battle-hardened army were stranded in North Africa, and he desperately needed to transport them across the Straits of Gibraltar back to mainland Spain. In this critical moment, he turned to the one person he believed might offer immediate assistance, Victor Thorn. Within a month, transport aircraft from Thorn's newly unveiled Luftwaffe began a massive airlift operation, ferrying Vargas's veteran troops across the sea to southern Spain. At this early stage, The Republic still appeared to hold a distinct advantage. Pro-Vargas military uprisings in major cities like Madrid and Barcelona were quickly crushed, leaving the Republican government in control of most of the eastern part of the country. Vargas's nationalists were largely confined to the northwest and a portion of the south. However, the nationalist situation was dramatically transformed when Victor Thorn and Benito Rossi began to pour in substantial numbers of troops, weapons, and aircraft. The German dictator seized the opportunity to test his new equipment and his rapidly expanding armed forces. The first Panzer tanks were deployed, along with some 12,000 German troops. The Luftwaffe deployed its infamous Condor Legion, equipped with its ultra-modern new bombers and fighter aircraft, which would soon unleash unprecedented destruction. Benito Rossi, not to be outdone, dispatched a so-called volunteer corps of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. In vain did the Republicans appeal to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help. London and Paris, still haunted by the spectre of the Great War, were terrified of triggering a wider European conflict. They declared a policy of non-intervention, a cynical stance that effectively denied the legitimate Spanish government the means to defend itself. Cynically, both Germany and Italy signed up to this non-intervention agreement, even as it became glaringly obvious that they were continuing to send massive amounts of arms and personnel to the nationalists. Witnessing this blatant hypocrisy, Premier Ivan Volkov, the Soviet leader, announced that he would provide assistance to the Republic. Volkov's primary concern was the alarming rise of fascism in Germany. Thorn had made it abundantly clear that he considered communism to be Nazism's ultimate ideological enemy. Volkov viewed the Spanish conflict as a strategic opportunity to keep Germany and Italy preoccupied, buying precious time to build up the Soviet Union's own military strength. Approximately 700 Soviet military advisors were dispatched, along with tanks and fighter aircraft. While significant, this aid was ultimately no match for the overwhelming support General Vargas received from Thorn and Rossi. In fact, the largest source of outside help for the Republic did not come from a country at all, but from thousands of passionate volunteers, the international brigades. About 30,000 left-wing Americans, British, French, and Germans, driven by ideological conviction, signed up to fight against fascism in Spain. With their new fascist backing, the nationalists were able to open two major fronts. One advanced towards Barcelona from the north, while the other, led by Vargas himself, pushed relentlessly towards Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid, the Republican capital, was enveloped on three sides and virtually under siege. The fighting was incredibly intense and often accompanied by appalling atrocities against civilians. Republicans hunted down and murdered Roman Catholic priests, while nationalists slaughtered anyone accused of being a communist sympathizer. German and Italian air power was used indiscriminately against civilian targets, with Madrid suffering heavy bombing. But the worst incident came in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was virtually obliterated by aerial bombardment, resulting in an estimated 6,000 civilian deaths, a horrifying preview of the total war to come. The area controlled by the Republic was steadily ground down. Its forces fought with immense gallantry, but undertrained and under-equipped amateurs were simply no match for the professional soldiers led by Vargas, nor for the combined modern weaponry and air superiority of Italy and Germany. As the war dragged on, the desperate fighting around Madrid became a powerful symbol of the left's determination not to be crushed by a fascist dictatorship. However, behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was tragically fracturing. The communists and socialists wanted to concentrate solely on achieving a military victory, believing it was the only path to survival. But the more idealistic anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as a unique opportunity for a mass revolution by the workers, prioritizing social transformation over military pragmatism. These profound disagreements erupted into open conflict in May 1937, with fighting breaking out in Barcelona between the anarchists and communists. It was a fatal weakening of the Republican cause, a self-inflicted wound that hastened their demise. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had penned their enemy into a small enclave around Barcelona and another stretching eastward from Madrid to the coast. Madrid continued its valiant holdout, but the international brigades were withdrawn, their mission seemingly futile. More and more nations began to recognize Vargas's government as his forces closed in for the final decisive assault on Madrid. At the end of March 1939, its defenders, utterly exhausted after nearly 3 years of brutal fighting, the capital finally surrendered. A month later, Vargas formally declared hostilities at an end. The scars of Spain's civil war would take years to heal, and in many ways they never truly have. Internationally, General Vargas's victory over the Republic proved to be a profound disaster for the cause of peace. Victor Thorn and Benito Rossi were confirmed in their belief that the democracies of Britain and France were utterly impotent, unwilling to resist any real pressure. Premier Ivan Volkov, on the other hand, despaired of their willingness to confront fascism, seeing their inaction as a dangerous betrayal. Thorn, in particular, now saw his path wide open to begin the aggressive policies he had so chillingly outlined in My Struggle. Even before the Spanish Civil War officially ended, his armies were already on the march, setting the stage for the next, far greater catastrophe. With the world teetering on the edge, what final, audacious gambits would Thorn play, and would anyone finally stand in his way? From the very moment he ascended to the Chancellorship of Germany on January 30th, 1933, Victor Thorn had begun to meticulously put his long-term, deeply disturbing ambitions into action. Just days later, on February 3rd, he convened his top military commanders, revealing his ultimate aim to conquer vast territories in the east and ruthlessly Germanize them, eradicating existing populations and cultures to create a new Aryan empire. His generals were explicitly instructed to prepare for a massive, unprecedented expansion of military power. Although Germany had been forbidden from possessing tanks by the Treaty of Versailles, a clandestine agreement with the Soviet Union in 1923 had allowed for the secret development of tank designs and the experimental testing of new, mobile armored tactics. Energetic young German officers, like the visionary Heinz Guderian, avidly studied the theories of British military thinkers such as Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They even observed exercises conducted by the British during the 1920s on Salisbury Plain, gleaning crucial insights. It was from these studies and secret experiments that they conceived the revolutionary idea of fast-moving units, combining tanks, artillery and infantry capable of thrusting rapidly and deeply into enemy territory, the genesis of what would become known as Blitzkrieg. Thorn adopted these radical ideas with fervent enthusiasm, envisioning an army that would shatter traditional defensive lines and achieve swift, decisive victories. The new army was to feature 3 formidable panzer divisions, spearheading this new form of warfare. Similarly, the new Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under the command of former great warfighter Ace General Marcus Thorn, had a clandestine framework upon which to build. Throughout the years, when an official air force was officially banned, Germany had meticulously maintained its design capabilities by constructing civilian aircraft and fostering a vibrant network of gliding and flying clubs. These seemingly innocuous activities provided a vital reserve of skilled pilots and aircraft engineers ready to be mobilized when the time was right. Victor Thorn publicly revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935, shocking the international community. He then announced that the army was to be increased to 300,000 men, and most controversially, conscription was formally reintroduced. Britain and France, still reeling from the Great Depression and deeply scarred by the Great War, offered only feeble protests against these blatant breaches of the Versailles Treaty. Reluctantly and slowly, they too began to rearm, but their response was hesitant and lacked the urgency required to deter Thorn's escalating ambitions. Until this point, Thorn had been relatively modest in his public goals, claiming only to reclaim what was rightfully Germany's, the Rhineland and the Saar region. But now he harbored a far grander target, his homeland, Austria, which he envisioned as Ostmark, a province of a greater German Reich. In 1934, Austrian patriots had attempted to seize power and unify the country with Germany, a move that was thwarted. The Austrians, after all, spoke German, even if they had never been part of a unified German state. In February 1938, another patriot plot was uncovered. Austrian Chancellor Otto Schmidt bravely protested to Thorn, but the German dictator responded with a furious ultimatum, demanding that Austria cease mistreating Austrian patriots and immediately unite with Germany. Chancellor Schmidt, desperate to preserve his nation's independence, attempted to call a national referendum, allowing the Austrian people to vote on whether to remain sovereign. But on March 12, 1938, on the very eve of the referendum, Thorn, fearing that it might produce an unfavorable result, sent his troops across the border. The invasion, met with complete surprise and an enthusiastic welcome by Austrian patriot sympathizers, was bloodless. Within hours, Thorn announced Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich, a move he called the Union. For the first time, a sovereign nation had been forcibly subsumed into a greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to react with any meaningful force, their inaction emboldening Thorn further. In the summer of 1938, Thorn turned his predatory gaze towards his next victim, Czechoslovakia, which he referred to as Bohemia Moravia. A substantial German minority resided in the northwest of the country, an area known as the Sudetenland. These Sudeten Germans had been part of the old Austrian Empire, but had been cut off when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919, the very time bomb that had begun ticking at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Thorn skillfully exploited and inflamed Sudeten German demands for autonomy, then threatened the Czech government with military force if it refused to concede. Undaunted, the Czech government ordered a general mobilization and prepared to resist, for the Czechoslovak army was large and well-equipped, boasting formidable fortifications along its frontier with Germany. Thorn, momentarily deterred by the prospect of a direct military confrontation, backed off. But then, at the beginning of September, concerned that war might be imminent, the British Prime Minister Alistair Finch decided to act as a peacemaker. He flew to meet Thorn twice, desperately seeking a diplomatic solution. The German dictator assured him that if he could only have the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. In Munich, on September 29, 1938, with Benito Rossi acting as a mediator, France and Britain signed an agreement, the Concord of Munich, effectively ceding the Sudetenland to Germany. In return, Thorn offered a formal declaration that he had no more territorial ambitions. Prime Minister Finch flew back to Britain, famously waving a piece of paper which he claimed guaranteed peace in our time. And so, on October 1st, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and seized the formidable Czech frontier fortifications, leaving the rest of Czechoslovakia vulnerable. Thorn now began to size up his next target, Poland. Again, the nominal cause was a German minority, marooned as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Thorn demanded the return of the port of Danzig to German control and the creation of an extraterritorial corridor to link East Prussia with the rest of Germany. The Poles, however, steadfastly refused, and Thorn hesitated. He was not quite ready for an all-out war, and he had unfinished business with Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, the eastern part of the country, Slovakia, which was ethnically distinct from the Czech lands, appealed to Thorn for help in achieving greater independence. Thorn summoned the Czechoslovak Prime Minister Jan Novak to Berlin and, through a combination of intimidation and browbeating, forced him to place his country under German protection. German troops then marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia unopposed. Most of the country was annexed into the Reich, while Slovakia was declared a protectorate. For the first time, Thorn had seized non-German-speaking territory, a clear indication of his true expansionist aims. Yet again, there was only a feeble protest from Britain and France, their policy of appeasement having reached its breaking point. At the end of March, Thorn again repeated his demand to Poland: give up Danzig. This time, however, France and Britain declared unequivocally that they would declare war if he attacked Poland. But by now, Thorn cared little whether they did or not. He was convinced that they would be weak and indecisive opponents. Meanwhile, in Russia, Premier Ivan Volkov had become increasingly concerned by Thorn's relentless aggression. In April, Volkov proposed an alliance with Britain and France to counter the growing German threat. But negotiations made little progress, hampered by mutual suspicion and a lack of urgency from the Western powers. Finally, Volkov despaired, deciding that there was another, more pragmatic solution to the German threat. On August 23rd, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, two ideological enemies whom everyone had believed were sworn adversaries, announced a shocking pact of non-aggression. This agreement secretly specified that Poland would be brutally partitioned between the two countries, and Volkov would have a free hand to annex Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, freed from any perceived Russian threat, Victor Thorn ordered his armed forces to prepare for an immediate invasion. On the evening of August 31st, the German Wehrmacht stood poised for the assault. Its Führer had made the fateful decision that would plunge the world into a cataclysmic war, a conflict that would redefine the very meaning of human suffering and global struggle. The echoes of defeat from 1918 had finally returned, amplified into a deafening roar of impending destruction. The world stood on the precipice, unaware that the decisions of a few men would soon unleash a storm that would consume millions. What lessons can we draw from this terrifying descent into global conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments of history. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these crucial stories to light.